get started, we for sure need to be out here by 11:30, is that correct? So a little bit earlier than that probably, so you can rest and have lunch. My name is Emily Fox. I am the Bayview School Counselor here at elementary school. School counselor, I was a school counselor here at the school for 7 years, and also I have been a special ed teacher and a classroom teacher and the director of the alternative program through all of years. This information that we're going to share with you today is probably one of the most exciting things I've encountered in my professional career, and so I'm really happy to be in a position where we share it with our own staff. And I have a co-presenter also.
Hi, my name is Edie Carr, and I came down from the Milwaukee area. I think everybody knows where that is. There's a chair here for somebody else to sit. And I also was trained with Emily to do this work. And in my working lifetime, I was the director of the Family Service Collaborative. There's 2 of them that serve St. Louis County, and that was what I did. I retired a couple of years ago. But this work is really fascinating me. And so I agreed to try to get trained to be a trainer and to talk about this work. I think it's very important, and I think most of you are probably familiar with it, but I think the more you hear it, the more it kind of starts to resonate and how it really does affect the kids that we work with in our communities and all of that. So we're happy to present this to you and hear your responses to it.
How many of you in here know your ACEs score? Just a couple. Okay, well you're in luck because today you're going to figure out your ACEs score. ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and we will go into depth about the study and how it might be impacting your classroom, what you're seeing on a daily basis. The concept of the ACEs study is got a lot of longitudinal data, but it examines, like, what if one of the largest public health discoveries has to do with the youngest of our community, the smallest in our population. And there's going to be a lot of heavy information that will be shared. So it might bring about some strong emotion in some of you, which is okay. We'll support each other. If you feel like you have to leave, or if you just had a lot of coffee and water, it's okay too. We won't be offended. But just know that there will be topics or maybe sensitive material to you, like household dysfunction, substance abuse, domestic violence, sexual abuse, neglect. We'll talk a lot about the neuroscience and neurodevelopment, how it impacts the physical body and health later in life. But it can be some pretty heavy information, and so just fair warning there. Any questions that you really want answered right off the bat, so we know for sure where we're headed, or anything that you're hoping for? Well, feel free to shout it out. This will be pretty informal. Let's get started.
Would you all prefer to have the lights off to see this better?
Yeah.
If you do, whoever closest can shut the light off. That's better. Just don't fall asleep.
Okay, so the ACEs study looks at early childhood experiences, early experiences in life, 0 to 18, and how early adversity increases the likelihood of physical, mental, or behavioral problems. The study was designed by Dr. Robert Anda. Actually, he collaborated with Dr. Vincent Coletti in conjunction with Kaiser Permanente, which is a managed care consortium in San Diego, California. The study was designed in the early 90s. They also worked with the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. But what the study confirms is that adversity early in life can produce many difficulties later in life, including mental health, physical health, relationship problems, workplace problems, disease, disability, and it's of the 17,000 participants, many of those people are still being followed today. So the research continues to come in. Okay, remember like Venus flytrap? BBC more. I'd like turn the plant, I'd move my podium, and it just like keeps coming. So if I disappear, somebody save me. Okay, let's move on to the human nervous system and how important our nervous system is. Our central nervous system is the brain, the spinal cord, and all of the receptors throughout the body, taking in information all of the time and sending messages to the brain, often instantaneously. So as a matter of survival, our messages throughout our body are traveling really quickly, and it's a well-oiled machine. So what happens to the neuroscience when an individual experiences adverse events early in childhood? Well, there's a disruption. That's the bottom line. And so toxic stress becomes hardwired within the body. Our central nervous system has the primary function of keeping us alive. Humans are meant to endure stressful situations with high release of cortisol and adrenaline for about 20 minutes at a time. Then your heart rate can go back down, your limbic system calms. But kids who are living in very stressful environments where they have what's called toxic stress, high cortisol levels all the time, are feeling very hyper vigilant. They're anxious. It leads to depression. We might have kids flee our classroom. We might have kids that never speak. All of those kinds of reactions that you're seeing in your classroom on a regular basis. Okay, synaptic density. This is, the wiring within the brain. So when a baby is born at birth, you can see that the synapses are there, but they're not, they haven't branched a lot to connect and make new connections. And that happens with life experiences. So when a baby's born, they need to eat, sleep, poop, right? And alert you somehow that they need your attention. And then new connections start to happen within the brain. I teach the brain a lot to elementary students, and I say to them, as you have new experiences and your brain starts to grow bigger and stronger, does your head actually get huge? And like we know the smartest people on the planet are the people with huge heads. They're like, no, your brain fills up by making new connections and new pathways, and the hemispheres connect and communicate. So by elementary age, 0 to 6, rapid brain development and new connections are made, and that's called branching within the neurons. By puberty, the brain starts to prune. I know. I said to the earlier group, I have 3 adolescents at my home, and I think my brain looks like this, and theirs is pruning, right? So it can be another time of change. And so this is the phenomenon of use it or lose it, and the brain adapts to what it knows and practices. So those of you that had music lessons early in life and didn't play anymore would struggle to start over. Would struggle to start over. So if you don't use it, you lose the information, and that's necessary for the brain to prune back. So if we were to look at that science and say, what about the child that's neglected? So comes into elementary school with not a lot of stimulation, not a lot of life experiences, the synaptic density is not going to be as profound. And kindergarten teachers know that in a heartbeat, don't you? Like, did this kid go to early childhood program? Did this kid go to a daycare? Did this, can we get the family in here and let's see what's going on? We need some enrichment materials at home. Let's try to connect them with community ed. Maybe we need to get the county involved, like whatever the case might be, because the brain needs to have lots of experiences, and a lot of those experiences are negative. That also forms pathways in the brain.
I always go back to that middle part where there's a lot of neurons happening when kids are young. And I just had an aha moment. I'm like, well, that's why it's easy to teach different languages to kids that are that age, because they can grow that stuff like mad. But when we get older, it's like we pruned it all away. And it's like, oh my gosh, we have to learn a new language. It's really difficult. And that's just how it happens. So that's just my aha moment. I just want to back up just quickly, and everybody should have a packet. They're on the end table there. And quickly, what's in here is Emily's ran off all the slides that we're going through on here. And then there's a section starting here that's talking a little bit about ACEs, just a kind of a summary. And then the next couple pages are about resilience, and we're going to talk about that towards the end. And then some things, and then then there's the actual ACE, the shortened form of the actual ACE score, which we're probably going to ask you to take out when Emily starts going over the actual study. And the last page is an evaluation. And we need you to fill this out before you go. This whole program is developed by Minnesota Caring for Communities. And they are tracking these talks all over the state. And they're trying to get like a baseline number so that there's a lot of people that understand this basic information. So they're using this on a statewide basis to help improve and decide where to go from there. So we're going to remind you again to do that. But we'll be bouncing back and forth. And Emily and I are tag teaming it, and it's interesting because we come from different backgrounds. So we'll probably be doing some repetitive speaking, but we do come from a different reality. So we'll be saying things in different ways. So if you hear a lot of repetition, that's why. So we're going to talk a little bit, build on that whole synopsis thing here. And we all have our own life, and it's very unique, and we all have our own experiences that we draw from all through our life. But for purposes of illustration, we're going to talk a little bit about, in general, two different worlds. So as we look at life and how kids grow up, we have two worlds. The top level is, say it's a benevolent world. So you are, a lot of times, feel like you're in danger, you feel unsafe. You maybe worry about if you're going to get food or clothing or be warm. And you always are energizing your fight, flight, and freeze in your limbic part of your brain. You're always there worrying about that, and that's always there. And that's all about our survival instinct. How do we survive every day? And if that's going on all the time, it goes into those synapses that Emily talked about, and that's what you remember. So you're constantly in your fight, flight, and freeze mode, and it remains there. It's good that we have stress. I mean, it's not bad, but when you're in constant stress for like 20 minutes or more on a regular basis, for purposes of this study, the scientists call that toxic stress. Your cortisol levels are high all the time. As in contrast then, that bottom world, if it's a benevolent world, you're safe, you have a roof over your head with warm clothes or cool clothes, depending on what Minnesota's bringing. You have access to people who care about you, you're treated well, you feel safe, and you manage very well. So very different ways of realities for kids, and especially when you talk about kids, they adapt then to each one of these worlds, however they adapt. So however, whatever happens to you, whatever end of the spectrum is, you adapt to it. And when you're young, it gets hardwired into your brain. You're young, but then you adapt to it as best you can, or you all in the education world help kids adapt to things. Neither one of these are good or bad. We all have some of that. We all have those times when we are in the danger zone. If we are in a near car accident, you go, ooh, it takes a while for your knees to quit shaking and all of that kind of thing. But we deal with it. And so it's not a bad thing. But some people are more adapted to that world. So can you think of, what am I trying to say? Are you thinking of jobs that might be appropriate for people who are better at dealing in that kind of world?
Police.
Right.
Military.
Military, exactly. they have adapted to those kinds of experiences better, and they are better able to survive. Or they're taught those skills, as in the military. I think, you know, you're taught, here's how you survive this world that we live in, where you need to be constantly vigilant about safety and survival. So that's not a bad thing. And some people just aren't, they start cut out for that. That's the whole career you want to have as a kid. The kids who are in that bottom level will not survive well in that world. So for kids who are grown up in war areas, they're in that world all the time. So they are always in high stress levels. And if they had a career, will probably do well in this because they are very adapted to that behavior. So part of this whole study about ACEs is about adapting to your life experiences. And what does that mean? What does it look like? What's the result of that? How's your behavior? How does that affect your behavior? How does that affect your social skills and all those other things? So again, it's not bad to have stress. It's just that when you have stress constant, it's not good. And when it happens at a young age, it gets hardwired. Once we're adults, we can deal with things much better because we've already have the skills and we've got our neurons built up, and that's what we do. And if we have problems, generally, if we're smart enough, we go find some help. Kids don't always have those skills. So that's why there's a difference. So you have a wonderful opportunity, and Emily mentioned it earlier, about building resilience early in kids and really helping prevent some of this stuff from happening and help give them skills to adapt to a different kind of life. So they're not always in that flight, freeze, and flee mode. I have a hard time saying those words.
I can tell you an example that we've had at the elementary school is stealing. So stealing is wrong, right? Stealing is wrong. You're in trouble, you stole. Well, it's not very kind to take your friend's materials or go in someone else's locker and take their private things, right? And we shouldn't steal at school. But what if that kid is growing up in an environment where stealing means food? Okay. What if Mom trained me to be a good thief so that we could continue to function? Right? This is a student who, just based on what I know from paperwork, family interviews, and working with the student for a while now, who has a 9 for sure ACEs score, maybe a 10. That's the max. So maladaptive behavior sometimes is to function in my world and to try to get by. You know? So, you know, we have sometimes these hard and fast rules, but we are designed to survive. And so how do we teach adapting to school environment and making friends and following the rules at school and connecting the family with resources, right? Without just saying, nope, bad, 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 bad. And so it kind of allows you to approach an individual from how did we get to this point? What has happened in your life? What can we do to help? We can't act like that in this environment, right? That's not how we treat each other here. That creates mistrust. Hard to have friends when you're taking their things. But I understand that sometimes it works for you in that world. So we can approach kids, if we understand the environment that they're coming from and what they've encountered, we can approach kids in a unconditional acceptance.
So this is just summarizes what we've talked about, is that when biology meets social expectations, they collide. Because your hardwired brain will win over your social expectations. So like Emily said, if this is how I'm thinking and how I behave, that will be what my go-to point is. So if for example, you know, you're in that mode and I just inadvertently touch you, you're like, oh my God, touch usually means hurt. They're running, and so you're like, what? And so part of that is you just have to understand that's what they're hardwired to do. So this just says biology wins. So those neurons that you've adapted, they adapted in their younger time are always going to rule over any other expectations you might have, which is why they don't do well in different situations. So,
or the kid that runs out of the classroom, right? almost every time, especially in the elementary school, a teacher will say, nothing scary was happening. They're not in danger in my class. I wasn't even like conversing with them. They weren't in trouble, right? But something happened, boom, they're gone, right? That is a flight response. It's not a personal thing with you. We know that you care for that kid, right? And so, but we're always looking for kids. Have you seen some of them, right? They're like tucked under a desk someplace, protecting themselves. Okay? So if we can remember that that maybe has been a matter of survival for them, that is a flight response initiated by the limbic system. Alert, stay safe, get the heck out of here. Okay? So it can be a response that doesn't have anything to do with the exact moment that it took place in.
In my world, I always say, if I was in your classroom, I go, Edie didn't wake up this morning just to tick you off today. That wasn't my goal. It's just the way that I'm responding to the social situation I'm in. So this time I go, make you irritated. It's just how I am. So you need to understand that. As our brain develops, we have certain parts and times that it becomes more susceptible than others and sensitive to those kinds of adverse experiences that we may be involved in when we're little. And why don't you bump it to the next one? I talk a little about that. So I'm going to read this because it's very specific about the times in a child's life when bad things happen. It affects them more than others. And so there are those times, and generally it's in the early years when those neurons and the synapses are developing hugely. That's a sensitive period. That's why we said early childhood and early learning is the most important time in their lives, because that's when it all starts developing. So part of the study is, when they talked about this, is that, and I'm going to read it so I don't mess it up, but there are certain times in kids' lives when certain things happen that they're more susceptible to having those adverse effects affect them more. So I'm going to say, the research says, like during middle childhood, I'm talking 7 to 13 years old now, emotional and verbal abuses can affect the centers for processing sound, developing verbal language, and perceiving social cues, 7 to 13. Effects are different for boys and girls. So both neglect and sexual abuse affect boys and girls both, but neglect in infancy through the toddler years. So what's toddler, 3, 4? For boys, has a big effect on the cross-brain communication, right thing. While cross-brain communication is much more affected in girls when they experience sexual abuse around ages 7 to 10. So boys experience that at an earlier age, they're affected worse, and girls at a later age. So it's interesting, and there's probably a ton more of that research out there, but that's not in our presentation here, and I'm not aware of all that, but I'm sure they've done a lot of studies on when those sensitive periods are and what experiences kids have at certain times in their lives that really profoundly affect them later on and how they react and how they adapt. So there's a ton of that out there in that brain research that Emily's talking about. It's the different parts of the brain and how they're affected, and it's just huge, and it's like mind-boggling. You wonder, how the heck do kids turn out good at all? I just don't know how any of us ever turned out at all when you look at what's going on and how they react in that. So it's interesting, but it's good to know that anything that we can do, the younger they are, the better outcomes we'll have in the long haul. Next one.
Yeah, so what Edie was talking about too, that cross-brain communication is called the corpus callosum, and that's considered the superhighway between the hemispheres of the brain. So that is disrupted depending upon the experience at different sensitive time periods of development for boys and girls. It's like really interesting stuff. The brain science behind ACEs, but just development in general. So this clearly states we have a collective choice. What we know is the more prevention, the better individuals are, better off individuals are in life. For health outcomes, for relationships, for school success, for economic independence. It just makes sense, right? So what we need to remember is that when kids live through adverse events, it does become a biological change. They become hardwired to adapt to that behavior. So I do want to just push pause for a minute. You have the short form ACEs in your packet. You can write on it, it's yours to keep. You don't have to write on it. We won't ask you to share your ACEs score publicly, of course. What I would ask is that we have a little bit larger group, so we might not be as efficient, but okay, you have some index, just half of an index card on your table. If you would, write just your score, no name or anything, write your score on the index card and just fold it in half. And we're going to see if we kind of match what the study showed. In our last group, we had 24 participants, and we matched almost perfectly what was revealed in the ACEs study of 17,000. So it's kind of interesting to see the results of the group.
Is there people, anybody who needs one representation? I need a writing tool.
Oh, yeah. The advantage of taking the short form too is that you will understand the study so much better if you know what types of questions they're asking. Anybody else? Yeah.
Thanks.
There are some of those sheets in the back too, if you.
Yes. At least. Yeah, Luke too. Don't even tell me all the bad stuff you hear about me. Nothing yet? I I know. And extra credit. Yeah. Anybody else have a score? Anything really pop out to you in the short form that you want to bring up to the whole group or that you're curious about? All right, we're going to move into the field of epidemiology. Epidemiologists study the origin of disease and disability and make some predictions about health concerns and why things are coming about. So we'll dive into the ACEs study. The ACEs study, again, 17,000 people, mostly white, middle class. They had access to health care in conjunction with Kaiser Permanente, so some of the best health care in the world. Only 6% of the population did not graduate from high school. So the results were profound, but imagine if we were to redo a large-scale study like that in a population that was a better representation with minorities, education level, urban areas, access to healthcare, transportation, all those external resources that sometimes we take for granted. Okay. Prior to the ACEs study, a lot of research had been done on individual isolated experiences. What's unique about the ACEs study is that it looks at lots of different areas. Three main areas, which household dysfunction, neglect, and abuse, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But the ultimate findings were that multiple forms of adverse experiences have profound effects later in life with public health problems. And we will define public health problems. We'll give you a whole list of what those public health problems might be, but how it plays into an adult life. I should mention also that of those 17,000 participants, the ages were like 19 to 24, and those people are still being followed if they're still alive, and reporting. I've been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. I've had X number of abusive relationships. Alcoholism is pervasive in my family, or whatever. So they're reporting those things. So the discoveries were that ACEs are common. There's three main categories: household dysfunction, neglect, and abuse. Household dysfunction categories are substance abuse, 30%. No, I also should say that when the individuals filled out the survey, it was longer than the 10 questions. What you took was the short form. But when they filled out the survey, they were adults, 19 and up, and it's their perception of what their household was. So does it mean that a parent has been through treatment? Not necessarily. It means that in their adult brain now, they're able to be reflective and look back and go, yeah, that was a problem. What I thought was kind of fun in games, I mean, even working at the high school, I had tons of kids come in and just say, I didn't really get it before. I thought it was just kind of fun and games and silly, but now I know when to just not even go in. Now I know, oh, I should put earplugs in when I go to bed because there's going to be a lot of fighting. So as the brain grows, right, and understands things differently, you can reflect back and know what's a problem and what's not. So parental separation and divorce, 23%. Divorce is there's a really high rate of divorce in our country. It's still considered an ACE because it is a large change in your child's life. Mental illness, again, it is the adult's perception of if mom was suffering from depression. It doesn't necessarily mean that there has to be a diagnosis of that. Battered mothers witnessing domestic abuse and violence. It doesn't have to be out of a married couple, it could be just an intimate couple. And then criminal behavior, 6%. I actually have been pretty surprised at the prevalence, even at the elementary level, of students who have been incarcerated. Not just a parent who's been arrested. Regularly, kids say to me, "Oh, the police were at our house this week," or regularly. But an incarcerated parent has been a surprise to me. So neglect, emotional and physical, and again we talked about the sensitive periods of development. It's interesting how early in life, if a boy is neglected, it affects that corpus callosum, superhighway. Abuse, emotional, physical, and sexual. I think some things have been questioned here in the sense of what is the definition of emotional abuse, and do people completely understand what that would be? Physical abuse, 30%, 1/3 of the participants, and then sexual abuse, 21%. So my guess is if that was defined clearly, it would probably be a little bit higher. Anything that stands out to you or questions about that? I do want to mention too that I've had a really awesome professional experience because I've been able to work with students K through 12. able to see that entire developmental, or multiple developmental stages. And now that I'm working with the little kids, sometimes there will be bits and pieces of information that they don't often want to reveal, parent that they love. So fast forward to adolescence, and things will surface, like sexual abuse, for example. When I was a high school counselor, sexual abuse would surface a lot. And if that came out to the parent, then they'd say, well, why didn't they say something when they were 7 years old, or whatever. Well, that's safety, that's what they know, there were threats, etc. So sometimes when things happen earlier in life, we can't process it until the brain is in a different stage. Does that make sense? For example, last week dealing with a 5th grader who was grieving the loss of a pet. Okay? The pet died a couple of years ago. So there is a piece of my brain that's like, why are we dealing? Like, are you going to test right now, or what are you trying to get out of, But the brain understands death and the permanency of death much different 9, 10 years old. So this student came to a different developmental stage in the brain that now could process the death of a pet differently. Does that make sense? So sometimes when things happen early in life, we need to deal with what's called unfinished business later in life. Not that you want to go through all of that again, but the brain can understand it differently. Okay, so ACEs are common. The results of the study, 0 ACEs, 33% of the 17,000. 1 ACE, 26%. 2 ACEs, 16, 3, 10%, and 4 or more, 16%. Do you have?
Yeah, I will divulge the results of this group. So I had 44 total, and so 19 of you had 0, which is 43%, so a little bit higher than this. 13 had 1, which was 29%. This is 26. It's hard to read.
Yeah.
3 people had 2, that's about 7%. 3 people had 3, had 7%, and then 4 or more were 6, which is 14%. So a little bit skewed. There's more of you with 0 in this group than there was last time, which is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So you're a little bit skewed from the national average. It's not good or bad, it's just the way it is. There we go.
Take a look at our own population.
Homogeneous group.
Slide 15.
Okay. So we're just going to look a little bit about some statistics now around the numbers and ACEs and what it reveals about populations in general. So all these slides are based on, usually the bottom is about how many ACEs there are, because I know this is hard to read. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or more, and then the percentage of people in the population with, excuse me, these health issues. So it's kind of a dose-response relationship. So it seems like the more ACEs that are acquired, the more chances that you have adverse effects later in life. Now, this isn't a destiny-fulfilling graph by any stretch of the imagination, so things can change. This isn't a given, but it's pretty typical of populations. And if you do these studies, and you were reading the Proctor student survey, and some of this is exactly the same. So it seems to hold true in a number of different populations. So it's just a generality. But as you can see, this happens. And those health problems are physical, mental, work-related, alcoholism, depression, drug use, all those kinds of things. So there's a number of different things that they lump into the health problem relationship. So the other option you need to look at, this isn't all, we can't be all depressing, is that for those people, even with 4 ACEs, it's at about, what, 43%. That still means, there's a lot of people that don't have those issues. So they look at the positive end of it. Okay, so now if you look at smoking, and I don't know, this is the same thing, and this is talking about ACE scores over here, same thing. They're talking about early initiation of smoking, current smoking, and COPD, so chronic lung problems. And again, percentage, which you can see, ACE is how it goes up, early initiation. So for kids that have, this would be 4 or more, probably about 13% start smoking early. For current smokers, it is even higher. This is 16-18% of people with 4 or more ACE scores that are smoking, and then with COPD, it's the same thing, just a lesser amount. But
I want to mention with the early initiation of smoking, so we have students at the elementary level who have smoked or vaped. Now, hopefully not on a regular basis, right? And I'm sure there's many that I don't know about. But what the research shows is that early initiation of smoking affects the frontal lobe, the development of the frontal lobe, which houses the prefrontal cortex, which, for those of you elementary classroom teachers, I call the upstairs brain if you've ever used the Mind Up curriculum. That's where we want most of our decision making to happen, right? It's the last thing to be fully developed. So when you remember dating someone in your early 20s and you're like, what is going on? Like, I can't even understand how you think, right? Okay, that's because we're still developing our prefrontal cortex. That's your upstairs brain. So if we have early initiation of smoking habits, and there's a disruption in that neurodevelopment of an individual, the likelihood that they are going to make great sound decisions, right, generally lead to other high-risk behaviors, which ACEs tend to cluster together, high-risk behaviors tend to cluster together. It truly does impact the development of the brain and decision-making and where you're headed in life, and it can derail someone. So, how do we get economic independence and employability and all of those things that we want later in life?
and a little bit more about smoking is that smoking, you can have this slide.
Okay.
Smoking is an adaptive behavior. We talked about those behaviors, how you relate to situations. And so one of the conundrums of public health has always been, how come people can't quit? You know, you should just be able to say, I don't want to smoke anymore, because it's a health problem. But when you look at the science behind this, it's difficult for people to do that because they're doing it for a different reason. And nicotine tends to have calming effect. So of course, if you're living in that, world of high danger and vigilance all the time, that calms you. Because for the people that I know that smoke, it's like when they're really nervous, that's when they smoke a lot of times. So it does have that. So that's part of the issue around getting people to quit. That's part of the public health. It just helps understand why people do what they do. And so smoking becomes an adaptive behavior. It's not a mental health issue particularly. But this leads to then some of the things that, if you've heard of trauma-informed care, have you heard of that term? So trauma-informed care is like the next step for working with people who have had trauma in their lives. And the difference between, I should say how we do it, but how it's typically been done and how they should do it is like generally, and we all do this, it's like, what the heck's wrong with you? Into what has happened to you? What's happened to you that's causing these kinds of behaviors and thought processes and adaptations? So you're really trying to understand what's happened and why kids are at the point they're at, and adults as well. Again, it's been hardwired in there, so it's not like we can just, I can just change that. It's not that easy. And so that's the understanding, I think, behind a lot of this that makes a difference. Okay, so this slide is around alcoholism. And so same thing, 4 or more people who are alcoholics, dose response, more ACEs, more likelihood of being an alcoholic. And then look at the married to an alcoholic. And this was interesting because some of the things they talked about when we went through this training is that so if people that you know, or if they're married to an alcoholic, and then they split up, and what do? They find another person that's an alcoholic, and you're like, what? Did you not realize what mistake that was the first time around? but the deal is that they know the rules of the game. So if you are living with an alcoholic, you adapt your behavior, right? You understand it, you keep doing things, it becomes habit, and then you get right back into that because that's your comfort level. So why do people keep going into the same bad relationships all over again? Is because it's comfortable. And they haven't necessarily built up those adaptive behaviors or adaptations that help deal with that so that they can say, oh yeah, that's not really appropriate. And so anyway, I thought that's just really kind of a brain burner because, and it's like all of us, if we're comfortable in, if you ever have to do those trainings where they're kind of touchy-feely and you get into those zones that we don't always like, and we talk about your feelings and all that kind of stuff. Some of you love that, I mean, some of us do say, yeah, we don't really want to go there. So, but it's good for you to get out of that comfort level because it does help us understand then how hard it is for people who have built these adaptations to not do it anymore. So it's when you start thinking about it that way, it really does affect the way that you look at other people and the way that you react to them. It makes a huge difference. I have a friend who had a traumatic brain injury, and she literally, her whole personality changed. I mean, literally a different person. And I can really relate because her social cues, she's gotten in a restaurant, it's like, ma'am, come over here. And that's, most of us are a little more subtle than that. But she just doesn't have that. So her, and this is artificially, but again, her brain has been hardwired differently because of that injury. And it totally shows up in the social cues. So that's where that biology and social expectations clash and really make a difference. So there's just a lot of things that sort of pop up when you start thinking about things that way. And the last one here on the in terms of graph is the depression piece. And again, mental health issue. Men and women, this is divided by. So the first one is women, men. Again, incrementally goes up as a number of basis increase. Interesting note, women are affected more by depression than men, which probably is, we already knew that. But this is pretty high, and it's one of the biggest mental health problems in our society today, and leads to a lot of things. So the differences between some of these adverse effects are mental health issues, and some are lifestyle behavior issues. So one thing kind of leads to the other, or they messed up together. So the other thing is if, and this was kind of a interesting reality to me. Imagine if you work with parents or even kids that are depressed all the time, and all the things that they just can't get done because they're in that, they just can't motivate. And if they have that happening every day, then you wonder why they can't make their appointments. You wonder why they don't show up at school. You wonder why they're late to bring their kids in. Or they just kind of, drop off the face of the earth because they simply cannot and do not have the skills to deal with public. And so the easiest thing to do, we all go back to our comfort zone, I'm gonna stay home and do what I do. And so, again, you say, you always look at the parents and say, well, they should be able to do that, but can they? And that's the question. And it's not what's wrong with you, why can't you get here? It's what happened to you and what is the issue that surrounds that decision that you make. Just an interesting analogy.
We've had an interesting observation at Baby over the last couple of years where students who have attendance issues, oftentimes they have a parent that's not employed, that they're home with, and they're caring for younger siblings. So it's interesting because you might think like, oh my gosh, how can this kid be absent all the time? Well, the parent also is not accountable to another system. So it's a whole family systems problem, but even in our society, like, how can that adult be so available, which allows the kid to stay home, right? Which allows them to be a caregiver to a younger child. And so, meanwhile, the child who's already struggling as a reader is missing all of ELA, right? So how can we as a school intercept them, be approachable, right? Because we all know that they stop answering their phone. So then we start calling them on their cell phone or Class Dojo or however you can get a hold of them. What can we help you with? How can we help you get here? Do you need gas money? Can we connect you with some services in our potentially there's an elementary school that's closer to your residence. That might be a better option for you, like having those conversations. But it's really interesting, the prevalence of attendance issues with parents who are also struggling with the same accountability issues. Okay, so some other examples of health concerns that happen later in life and what the research showed. So we've talked about some big ones, but even things like fetal death, so the health of a pregnant mother, or in an abusive relationship, how that can lead to fetal death later on. Intimate partner violence, really prevalent in household dysfunction. Obesity, clearly a national problem at this point. Why is that happening? Is it stress? Is it that the body is having a hard time absorbing nutrients? Is it because sometimes unhealthy food is cheaper food, starchy food, whatever the case might be? Sexual behavior problems, high risk behaviors, sexual promiscuity, unintended pregnancies, that in general is down across the country, but also workplace problems, which is really interesting. So people maxing out their sick time leave, people showing up late, people getting hurt on the job and claiming disability, people causing insurance prices to go way up because they're utilizing medical services that were unnecessary. So all of those kinds of factors that play into work problem places, productivity, relationships with colleagues, all of those pieces that, like you were saying earlier, these maladaptive behaviors that come into environments where the social expectations are very different. Okay, so ACEs are common and interrelated. We would often say, I've said for 20 years that I've been in education, and the cycle continues. What we notice in the child, we also see it happening in the parents. Intergenerational transmission of trauma is a really interesting phenomenon. How families pass down experiences, not just in how they're raising their kids in that nurturing environment, but the nature of it, like how biologically are we passing things on to our offspring. This is just the condensed presentation, but the larger presentation has a interesting study in it of lab rats that, conditioned environment, the odor of cherry blossoms introduced to lab rats. They're conditioned to have an adverse stimuli, which is probably a shock. It would be bad. But so then you see what happens when just the odor comes into their living environment. You see frightened. The rats huddle together. They start trembling, even without the adverse stimuli coming in. Those rats have pups, so babies, they're removed from the situation. They never encounter that odor in conjunction with shock or some kind of adverse stimuli. When the odor is introduced, they huddle together and are frightened. Right? They don't know why, right? Because they haven't actually been hurt when that odor comes in. So what is it that we actually travels down? Also historical trauma, if you're ever interested in that topic, especially in northern Minnesota. The Native American population, there's been lots of research lately about historical trauma and how that passes down from generation to generation. Really, really, really interesting stuff, like all the boarding school stuff and how that has traveled down over the generations. So,
I think Fond du Lac got some grant money to take a look at some of that, about how the ACEs are affecting the population on the reservation and how it intersperses and how does the intergenerational transmission of that go down and historical trauma effect and some of that. So they're doing some of that now. So it'll be interesting to see. I'm sure they're not at the point to produce any information right now, but they are really working on that heavily in that area. So that'll be interesting to see what comes out of that and how they determine some results and outcomes from that. Okay, so this is just talking about cumulative impact of ACEs and all the things that epidemiologists have said could be caused by higher ACE scores. So this is just like a broad overview, and how, I think I talked about it earlier, was that if we can do some prevention, we don't have to just do one thing. When you prevent ACEs, you can prevent a whole quadrant of stuff. And so the good news is that prevention is a broad-based thing, and it's very effective. So, for example, if we have alcoholism, according to this on this splat, 65% could be prevented if we reduce the number of ACEs, just based on that dose relationship effect of the graphs. Or, let's look at another one, workplace injury. They say you could reduce that by 25% by helping to prevent ACEs or helping with that adaptive behavior. So this is that whole cumulative effect and how that could affect the population as a whole. So that's part of what, when they're saying, the scientists who did the study are saying, this is the biggest public health information and prevention study around, is because this is huge. If we can reduce ACEs in general, look at all the things that we can help reduce at the same time. You know, typically we work in silos and, you know, every agency does their own thing, every family does their own thing, but what a great thing this would be is if we could help do this and then cumulatively improve the outcomes of the population in general over a big, broad space. I mean, it's a huge when you think about it. It's like hitting the sweet spot. You can hit the sweet spot and solve a lot of issues at one time. This is really an efficient thing to think about, and how we might react to it, and how we might practice some resiliency and asset building to help it along.
So we see the importance of early childhood and parent training early in life, and having resources for parents to access, especially like you high school teachers. I mean, you're getting a student when they're 14 years old. So what the Minnesota Student Survey says is that 8th grade students are just as likely as 11th grade students to report 4 or more ACEs. So if a child is growing up in an environment with household dysfunction, abuse, or neglect, they have experienced that prior to 8th grade if it's a score of 4 or more. Does that make sense? So it's not generally some like life-altering situation in 10th grade. And this is an environment that kids are growing up in. So we really need to try to communicate with families early, parenting tips, giving resources, offering respite care potentially, connecting with experts that can help with challenging behaviors. The ACEs information, and I can't remember if I said this to this group, but to the last group, one thing that might be a little frustrating with you today is, or for you today, is that this is information about kind of all the problems and what the research shows, and you know, like, how do we help protect kids? And this particular study isn't necessarily a roadmap for what to do to solve the problem necessarily, but it calls us to action now that you have this information. What can you do on a daily basis? What are you already doing? Where would you like to put some more efforts? Do you see a gap in our community or our school community that needs to be filled in order to be a protective factor for students? And so hopefully we can spend a little time too on what are we doing well already? What could we do in the future? If we were to look at one individual student that's struggling, the next layer around them is their family, and then it's school. So if they don't have a family that they can count on, or even one individual, school is next. Like, it's us. We're who they need to look to. So I gave the example earlier too that last year I had, Emily Boss, please report to your office. I'm like, okay, what's going on? I'm like hustling up there, you know, thinking a kid's like really escalated or something. There was a mom who I talked to a couple times on the phone, and she needed to see me right now. I'm like, oh, okay, nice to meet you. What can I do to help? I needed to come see you because the police are on their way to arrest my husband for domestic violence and child and baby. And unfortunately, they moved. That's another really common thing. And I was like, oh, okay, well, how can I help? Did you need me to get your daughter? What's going on? She's like, no, like, you're my friend. You have to help me get through this. I'm like, what? No, that's not my definition of a friend. Like, who are your friends? No one. How about your parents? Nope, I'm estranged from them. I've been in this abusive relationship for too long. No connections with them. Do you have any brothers or sisters? Yeah, but they don't talk to me anymore. How about a neighbor? It's an older gentleman. I can't reach out to him. Do you have a job? Yes, I do. Colleague? Nope. Like, literally, I look at all of these external factors in her life. No one. And never met the woman before. It's like, okay, we need to help you make friends and get connected with your colleagues and create an environment where you and your kids can be safe. Right? So can you imagine having a huge life situation like this, where you literally only had the elementary school counselor who you never met before to go to? It's hard for me to even imagine. I had Allison Fay come in from the Jacob Wetterling Resource Foundation to the elementary level. I've had her for 3 years now, and she does an awesome job with protective factors, but she makes kids identify 5 individuals, adults. Can't be the dog, can't be your baby sister or something. Has to be 5 adults that you could go to, because then when an individual is struggling or spiraling, they have a net that catches them. Right? And that's good advice for us as adults, even to always have your safety net and your support system. So there are some things that we can do to encourage families and kids and protective factors. And I just found out, Anna Urban told me in the last session, I didn't know this, but this woman is a professor at the U of M Twin Cities campus, and she runs a homeless shelter on Washington Avenue near the university. So she continues to do lots of research right here in Minnesota. So.
Yeah, and so basically we look at, and now we're kind of moving from the science into the protective systems and resilience and that. So basically they're saying there's 3 ways we can work within our community, how we define community. And we need to look at individual capabilities. So how can you, as an individual, help kids, help their families adapt, build skills to have better outcomes in their world. Attachment and belonging, how do you do it, like Emily said, how do you get people to be able to list 5 or 6 people that they can go to if they have issues? And then building community in the broader sense of the word community. There's interesting things going on in the state of Minnesota, some things that are happening in communities in terms of how they're addressing this and how they're dealing with it. But it's all in its early stages, so stay tuned to what's happening in Minnesota, because I think Minnesota is not far after the state of Washington, where this has really been going for quite a while, and it's where Minnesota went to sort of learn about this stuff and grow this whole program and this whole training. And they really are having some really outstanding outcomes by doing some basic things. And I talked earlier about when you look about prevention, you really deal with everybody, so you don't have to say, I always say we always have a bad case of programitis. We get a problem and then we get programmed, and that's supposed to fix a problem. And we get another problem, we get another program, and we fix it, try to fix it. And this is not that at all. It's not a program. It's just a different way of looking at the problem and why it happens, and then how you as an individual, how we as a community then can do things that will help everybody adapt better and get along better in the reality in which they're living in. So they're talking about this in different, you can describe that community however, but as a school system, how do you as a school system deal with stuff like this systematically? How do you do it in your classroom? How do you do it individually to kids one-on-one, depending on your role in the room? But a lot of this is, and there's a lot of stuff out there too on classroom adaptations on how you can handle things differently. So it's not take more of your time, it's not a program, it's just how do you react to these situations as they occur? And how do you help that incrementally kids do better? And that's what it's about. It's just about how do you move them along that continuum a little bit more.
And provide hope. That goes a long way. Lots of research on the power of hope, and Brian Wida actually just stayed after the last session too, and he said hands down in his work, hope is one of the most powerful tools in keeping individuals moving forward, continuing to connect with other people, and getting up each morning to keep going forward. I also put on your tables, if you're sitting at a table, those little flyers. Sheila, would you hold that up? Yeah. That is from the Minnesota Search Institute. I've had those for years, ever since, I can't remember exactly who was on that committee in the high school. So maybe like 12 years or so. When I was at the high school, we went to St. Louis Park and looked at their model program, but they really focus their school around the 40 developmental assets from the Search Institute, which is a Minneapolis-based company. And it talks about internal capabilities and assets and external capabilities and assets. And when I was a high school counselor, I used to have 9th graders fill out the 40 developmental asset questionnaire. And it was very interesting. I just remember, in general, a lot of kids did not feel connected with adults outside of the school environment, so in their communities. It was hard for them to identify individuals that they could go to or groups that they were involved in outside of school, which was something that we had to focus on, right, and build upon. But it also was really telling about how important the school environment is and how important relationships at school, clubs, sports teams. I think that's an awesome thing about Proctor with our size. Never should financial difficulties prohibit a student from being involved with something. I think we have lots of kids who have lots of opportunities that maybe in another school wouldn't have those opportunities or those connections. So I think that's something that we're really doing well here in Proctor. So clearly relationships are important.
No, that's it. I just want to make a statement about relationships that I remember years ago, and it just really stuck with me. And the question they asked us was, they said, well, would you, you don't open a checking account on your first date. You know, you got to go out to dinner and a movie and whatever. Before you, so you build that trust and that, you've got to build a relationship first. And so that's what I always remember when I hear about relationships. You don't just jump into things when you first meet people. You have to sort of wine and dine and woo them along. And so that's always stuck with me, is about how you build trust with people and your colleagues and that whole thing, and how do you build teams and that thing. So learning how to do that is pretty important, but we got to remember, we don't jump to that opening a checking account on the first date. You have to kind of do some building blocks ahead of time, and you have to do the same thing with kids and families. So I think that's just one of those statements that's always stuck with me about relationships and how important they are. And I think I mentioned earlier, there are some communities in Minnesota that are doing some great things, but they really want to, they, meaning the Minnesota Communities Caring for Kids, they really want to help get this information throughout communities and segments. I mean, this is being presented at like social services, at corrections, and all kinds of other scouting things and all those places, so people just have an understanding, the same understanding, which is why we use some of the similar language that the expectations are. So we all are on the same basis, on the same page in terms of, let's understand why people do what they do, at least try. And then it's up to us, community, to try to go the next step. It's like, okay, now what? Which is always our question. So it isn't, there's no handbook that says, okay, now what, Proctor School, you will do this X, Y, Z. That's you're adults, we have to step up to the plate and decide what's good for our school, what's good for Proctor, what's good for the community, what's good for our school, in terms of how we can help improve outcomes of kids and the families that we work with by what we do in our community. And so that's kind of the next step, and I know probably some of you are doing some things already, and there's a lot of schools, and there's a great film, Paper Tigers was out earlier. They talked about some schools in Washington who have done some amazing things by not, and I don't think it even costs them any money. It's not even about money, believe that or not. It's about, here's some different ways we're relating to kids and building those relationships that are making a huge effect on how they are adapting their behavior and how they are relating to the school environment. It's huge, and you can look at a ton of that stuff up online.
Has anybody seen Paper Tigers? You can take a graduate class in it. I've taken that class, and then it gives you access to the film. But it's a Walla Walla school out in Washington.
State of Washington.
Yeah, state of Washington, and it's really fantastic program. Now, it is alternative ed, so a little bit easier to manipulate. The schedules are a little bit more flexible, right? Staff is a little bit more staff compared to what I want to say. Student to staff ratio is a little bit easier to manage. So, but the approach of the student is really fantastic.
Takes a village.
Yeah. Is there anything that you know that we're doing really well or that we need? Like anything that's really done outstanding? I know for me, in the unique experience of working in the same district, K through 12, I've been able to see that like how important it is for kids to have exposure to enriching opportunities, especially early in life. So it's amazing to me the number of kids that come to school that don't even know the correct way to hold a book. Sometimes they'll hold it upside down, they'll flip the wrong way. True story, kindergarten teachers? True story. You know, knowledge of letters, how to communicate, problem solve. Kindergarten has this awesome thing called the peace path. You know, even conflict happens in kindergarten. How do you resolve that? You know, so I would say a community, what's called a high capacity community, has many opportunities for even low income families to have enriching experiences and exposure early in life. And that, of course, even with the brain science that we shared earlier, can make a big difference later on. So, let's see, how about, like, we have some different options now. We just have, like, maybe 5 minutes left or so. So leadership expansion is really important. Taking on roles, identifying goals in the community, coming together and figuring out what we value as a community. Shared learning, so opportunities like this. I know all of you have specialized training and things also. And then making decisions that are results oriented. Lifting up all beings, which I think is important. Remembering that even the students that we struggle with are a member of our society. They're going to grow up to be an adult someday. We talk a lot about this. John Ossip and I, let's remember, only 8 or 9 right now, but going to be a man someday. So how do we treat an 8 or 9-year-old now to learn great skills, to be better included within our school environment and adapt to societal expectations? Because this individual is going to grow up to be a man and going to be productive, right? Or same thing with girls, same conversation. We can look at the Minnesota Student Survey if you want to know any results. They basically align with the ACES study. I didn't include the Minnesota Student Survey in your packets, but the results are from 2016. Bottom line is, the higher the ACE score, the more likelihood of difficulties in school, academic failure, poverty, homelessness, high-risk behavior, drug use, incarceration, the list goes on. There's also in your packet the resilience page, building resilience. If anybody has questions about that, it's actually a really great page. I think something like for me that really spoke to me on this was on the back side or the second page, the difference between shame and guilt. If you've ever thought about that before. Guilt is, I feel bad for something I've done, having that remorse over behavior. Shame is an internalized feeling of self-worth and value. And so when we are trying to hold a child accountable for their actions, it's okay to experience guilt, right? I want to correct this, I can take action to make it better. Shame is really hard to wrestle with, right? Feelings of self-hate. So we have to be careful in the words that we use with students, even when we're trying to teach really important lessons. What else? Questions? Yeah, anything that really stood out to you? I think on February 15th is our next in-service. Gina Cole and I have talked about having a film screening of the documentary called Resilience. And it is aligned with the ACEs study and what some communities are doing to what we used to call wraparound services, you know, where you work like with healthcare, social services, the schools, the families, the community, how they're taking into account all of those different entities to best support and lift up students, but you know, building resilience. So if you, there's a lot more brain science too, but if you ever, we're all on the same team, so if you ever want more information or just have conversation, let me drop in. Really excited about this kind of research and information. Yeah.
So just remember, Emily does have a lot of this information and background, and then, again, be looking for what other communities and schools are going to be doing in order to address this, because a lot of them are already working on things. But just two things we hope you leave with. Number one is that you understand better about where people are coming from and why they are the way they are. And again, they didn't wake up this morning and just tick you off today. And that there are things that you can do that are easy and that you just have to think differently about them. And so part of it is internal, and that you can do your part very easily without a lot of, without effort and money and all those other things that are always an issue with our days. So hopefully you can just take this and address it and use it how you can in your own environment and your own team and community.
If you would take the time to fill out the survey, we actually mail those into the state
Evaluation last page.
Yeah, and then there's